The following is a presentation of the Match Talk Podcast Network.
Hello, wrestling fans. It's time for the World Wrestling Resource Podcast. The World Wrestling Resource was made that you as a wrestler, parent, coach, or fan can have access to all the resources of the very best in the world of wrestling. I'm three-time wrestling writer and broadcaster of the year, Jason Bryant, and I want you to join me, along with John McGovern and world champions Terry Brands and Dennis Hall, as we talk training tips, topical discussion, mental preparation, and more on the World Wrestling Resource Podcast. World Wrestling Resource is sponsored by Defense Soap. Find World Wrestling Resource on Facebook at facebook.com/World Wrestling Resource and follow us on Twitter at WWR50. And, of course, on the web at worldwrestlingresource.com. Now on to the show as we join John McGovern, Terry Brands, and Dennis Hall. Episode 50 of the World Wrestling Resource Podcast. Jason Bryan here with you today. We're going to head to the wonderful town of Waterloo, Iowa, one of the wrestling capitals of the universe, and talk to Kyle Klingman, the director of the National Wrestling Hall of Fame's Dan Gable Museum. But before we do that, we'd like to give you a big shout out to our sponsors of this show, Defense Soap, as Defense Soap has always been dedicated to the proposition that the only place wrestlers should find their opponents is on the mat. Defense Soap is available globally through a network of international distributors, and thanks to the employees dedicated to making the best hygiene products on earth, we're proud to be helping athletes all over the world compete in a healthier way. Check them out at defensesoap.com. Kyle Klingman, you know about the Defense Soap, right? That's in your shower each day.
Man, I don't know about it, but I know it works, Jason. I know that it has to work.
You don't know firsthand. You know about it because you've heard of wrestlers using it. You yourself, though, as a retired middle school wrestler and long-distance runner, don't really have a big use for it, though, from your office there in Waterloo.
You've compelled me, though, to try it, because now that we have a lot of wrestlers training at the Gable Museum, I think it's important for us to have it. So I'd like to get on the Defense Soap bandwagon and be a part of it. So I've heard nothing but great things about Defense Soap. So if I can find out a way to get a couple bars, we'll have it here at the showers of the Gable Museum.
You hear that guy out there? That was the best pitch you could ever ask for on this program. Anyway, today we're talking with Kyle Klingman as we record this on October 26, 2017. Big things happening at the Gable Museum this coming weekend as it starts today as we record this. If you're listening on your drive into the preseason nationals, perfect time to listen to this program. The 27th, 28th, 29th weekend. Big things going on at the Gable Museum. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about that?
Well, we're kicking off today. You mentioned today is the 26th. We're kicking off an artifact memorabilia clearance sale here at the Gable Museum. And it's fun because we have a lot of posters that we've gone through, a lot of books, a lot of DVDs, shirts that we're selling. So we've just had a surplus over the years. And when you compile some things and we're going through renovation, we just need to clear a few things out. They're great items. There's some of those iconic Iowa wrestling posters, some of the old school Cale Sanderson posters, Iowa State, UNI, some Oklahoma State filtered in there. Even in Augsburg made the cut. So we're excited to have that. That starts today. And we had it coincide with the preseason nationals. So I think it works great with all of those people coming through Cedar Falls, Waterloo. Hopefully they stop by the museum. Jason, this event is really why we came to Waterloo, not just specifically, but that we got these great events coming to Cedar Falls, Waterloo, especially the Unidome, and you get over 2,500 kids signing up. That's special. And we would get a lot of out-of-staters come to the museum. You mentioned that we're one of the wrestling capitals of the world. In my mind, we are the wrestling capital of the world. We have so much here to offer, and I feel like we're at the epicenter, and it's just a lot of fun. So I hope people will take advantage of coming to the Gable Museum, not only seeing the museum, but also getting in on the memorabilia sale we have going.
You said shirts because there's two things that when I go down to the Gable Museum that I'm really interested in. The first, I brought back a pile of old binders last year, folks, and that gave me the access to some of this data. And it was, I believe it belonged to Ed Ewalt who had donated it, and we've digitized some of that stuff. It was the hometowns of every Division I All-American, and it started in 1928 is where these records began. And another thing, now you mentioned shirts, is as we record this, I'm on day 198 in a row of a different wrestling t-shirt, whether it be a company, a college, a club, a high school. I've got wrestling shirts at the wazoo. I'm 198, and it's probably going to end up. I might be clear through December after this weekend, after I show up, and my wife's not going to like this coming home with a car full of new stuff.
I think you should go all the way until you reach Chris Taylor's weight. How does that sound?
I told Abby, who, for those of you unfamiliar with the other shows on the network, Abby's my loving wife of almost 8 years. I said I'd stop at a year if it ever got to that. So 365 is where I will top out on this, and then I will, maybe have an opportunity to contribute some of those things back to the Gable Museum for another memorabilia sale in the future. But other things
cool.
I like the Gable Museum because and the stuff that's not on display, the stuff that you guys have to rifle through in the basement there, it's like that's like the treasure trove of data. I mean, you see stuff that's been donated through the years, and now that you guys have had the plumbing situation taken care of, there was a massive flood a couple years ago that took out a lot of stuff. And explain the storage situation now and how the museum has recovered from that flood.
Well, just a quick story talking about the archives that we have in those Ed Ewald archives that are really treasures for us as historians. I really love having that here. Someone had emailed us and said, hey, I'm about to die. I want to be able to show that I wrestled at the Division II NCAA championships for UNO. But as you know, and I know, there's really not any D2 records out there for the full brackets. You can get the place winners. But he contacted us. I said, I don't know. I contacted you. I contacted some other people, and they just didn't have anything. And so our intern said, you know what? I'm going to find this for you. And so he went down in the basement. 15 minutes later, he popped up with the bracket that Eddie Walt had. I sent it to him, and it was just like his life was made. He had a little bit of a memory lapse on what he had said happened at the tournament. The scores were different, but we got to verify what happened. So it's a lot of fun to be able to have that. I'm excited that you're going to get to come down because you're coming down for the preseason nationals. I want you to go through some of our archives. Real Pro Wrestling gave us a whole bunch of their stuff. And so we have just buckets and buckets of some of the old videos, and I don't know what to do with it. You're the tech guru, Jason, so I'm hoping you can give us some advice. But we have all of our archives now. It's pretty much laid out. I'd say we're about 80% where we need to be as far as just having it organized. You're going to get to see this weekend what it looks like. But the archives are a great part. My favorite part of the museum is the basement because you have all of that great history there, all of those archives, and I just love spending time going through them.
And you talk about the renovation. How much of the renovation is going to be able to showcase some of that stuff? Because the Hall of Fame proper down in Stillwater recently went through renovation for the 40th anniversary, which was a year and a half ago at this point. And they had some new ways to display some of these artifacts that they have, and they will rotate throughout the course of it. What renovation plans are there for the museum in Iowa and I guess a similar vein?
Ours is going to be a hybrid of what theirs looks like. So Bob Buckley, who is one of our board members from Waterloo, really the guy that was responsible to be able to get this Gable Museum in Waterloo, Iowa, he was essential in getting that renovation in Stillwater, Oklahoma. He and Chris DeGraff was really the ones driving that. So they had a vision, and Bob Buckley just got it in his head and said, hey, we're going to do this right. Let's make it similar to Stillwater. They have the prototype. Let's use it. So ours is going to be different, and then we're going to have a larger wrestling room. We have a small one right now, but it's going to triple in size. And then we're just going to have a different layout in the museum with a bigger theater, just some different opportunities with technology, which is really what museums are going towards. So it's going to be a completely different museum. If you stop by the museum, you're going to see just some outlines, the pictures of what it looks like to have the museum renovated. But the wrestling room is going to be really at the epicenter of what we're doing. And I'm excited about what the end game is going to look like for the Gable Museum.
And for those unfamiliar, those who haven't been down there, or at least haven't been down there in recent years, you mentioned the wrestling room and say, well, why does a museum need a wrestling room? You guys run a club out of there.
We do, yeah. We have club practice 2 nights a week. We're going to probably bump that up to 3 nights a week right now. The Female Elite Wrestling Club wants to be able to go on Fridays, so we're working on making that happen. So it's fun that we get to be on the cutting edge of that and really take it to the next level. And my goal, my end game, again, with this is that we can get some regional training center practices here occasionally. We get some just high-level competition, high-level practices out of the Gable Museum. And I know there's been some talk about working with USA Wrestling about having some of their teaching seminars and their camps and clinics here at the museum for their workshops. It'd be fun to be able to have us be the place to go for that. So very exciting to have the wrestling room and make this another level up, because as you know, with museums, Jason, you go one time. I've been to the Cooperstown Museum, and it's awesome. I went in 1999, but I haven't been back. Well, we're giving people reasons to come back time and time again, and I think the wrestling room is a big part of why you can come back and be part of the history.
Yeah, and I remember hearing, I can't remember which parent it was. It might have been Chris Ball, who was talking about his son, or somebody brought their kid down to Stillwater, and I think this is before Chris moved to Stillwater, Oklahoma from Stillwater, Minnesota, is that he was curious on, it's like, hey, you got your shoes? My son needs, John Smith's like, hey, you got your shoes? My son needs somebody to roll around with. So you never know who you can walk in and get a little drill with. I mean, sometimes you're walking in, there might be a college All-American out there. Yeah, let's get a workout in. I mean, this could be one of those things that changes some people's like trajectory and how much they appreciate the sport. It's always cool to hear stories like that. But one thing that the museum, and this is one thing that I'm really hoping people listening take to heart, is when you go to these places, yes, like you said, they're not always the same thing. That's the goal. And next time I go to Stillwater, I expect to see different displays, and they've changed things out for teams that are coming in and things of that nature. But the history of our sport in our internet era seems to be falling further and further away. I mean, how important is it for us as wrestling people and the fans out there to understand that this history needs to be honored, appreciated, and really understood?
I think it's of crucial importance, because I think we live in a bubble. I think people today don't look past Jordan Burroughs and Kyle Snyder. And just an example of that is that Lee Kemp, who you had on the program, he's going to be at the preseason nationals. And I would put him in the top 5 greatest American wrestlers ever, comparable to, if you talk about other sports, to Willie Mays in baseball, Jim Brown in football. He's of that caliber, and he's probably going to go largely unnoticed on the Unidome floor. He's one of our icons on the sport. So we really need to elevate that history so that people understand that and have a working knowledge. And I don't know what the answer is, Jason. I don't know if at all of these tournaments you find out who's here and put them on a pedestal so that people know who's in attendance. I think that's an important part. But it really is important that people come here and understand the history, because it's unprecedented access we have to understanding the past. We have so many great videos and so many outlets, but we need to take time to really understand who paved the way and who were the pioneers that made this possible for us to have these great tournaments.
One thing I also want to say that you guys have done at the Gable Museum, and actually this started before it was even affiliated with the National Wrestling Hall of Fame in an official capacity, is you are approaching, and I'm guessing this is an approximation, but I think we've ironed it down to 500 episodes of On the Mat. And On the Mat is a show that runs out of 1650 The Fan and the Cedar Valley radio station there. You've been doing a weekly talk show for high school, college, Olympic level wrestling for years now. I think we're almost approaching the 10-year mark. 500 episodes. You've got you and I and the Panther Wrestling Club. They get an episode a month. Where did this idea come from years ago? And now that we obviously have it on a podcast, you can go back and listen. I think we have up to 2010 restored again. But where was the idea? Where does the funding come from? And how do you go about getting guests to make the Gable Museum relevant nationally?
I just think it's funny just talking about the history coming on 500 shows, because you were part of that whole history. And it's just funny to think back of what it took for you to be able to record that show, because Matt Talk Online is good enough to have that show on your podcast system for us. But now it's a pretty easy system. But starting out, Jason, as you know, it was really difficult. And I remember those early shows where I asked Scott, the producer, to record a show, or how could we get it, because it's a great guest. And he said, hey, you're just going to have to get a tape recorder, a tape deck, and just put it in there, and then just turn the radio on and record it off the radio regular. They didn't have that technology. So that was 2007. You would think we'd be up to speed on that. But no, we weren't at the time. And I think it was just an opportunity at the time where we wanted to be able to have an outlet for the Gable Museum to talk about the sport. And this is a community that deserves to hear more about the sport. And as far as guests are concerned, I try to make it relevant when it's relevant to the season, but during the summer months, I would really like to go the historical route. I like to get in depth, and Jim Gibbons challenged me once because I had him on for a segment and it lasted 15 minutes, and he said we're just getting started. And so, as you know, Jason, a podcast format's different because you can go on 2 hours. There's really no time limitations, but we're up against that where we have an hour show. We have to take breaks and we have to check in with who the guest is because it's a live show. And so it makes it different on how we approach it. Podcast interviews are a lot different than on-air live interviews, and you have to take that into consideration. So it works good when you're trying to get a coach that just wants to be on for maybe 15 minutes, but be able to get the in-depth like you got with Lee Kemp or other guys. It can be a challenge for us. So that's just a little bit of the history, but I know you've had fun with it too. And I remember all those texts you sent me with the start stream reminder, and you don't have to do that anymore. It's a great setup.
Yeah, just and not to pat myself on the back here by any means, but how we recorded the show is it started when I was at USA Wrestling, and I had the original USA Wrestling Mat Chat podcast, and this is after Kyle and I had the Wrestling 411 podcast, so we didn't even know it was a podcast back in 2008. We're like, I remember coming to you one day going, "Hey, Kyle, you know this is on iTunes?" You're like, "Really? How do we listen?" I go, "I don't know yet." So I had to figure out what that was with the old 411. But when I had Mat Chat, I was like, all right, we got to get on the mat. You sent me some CDs, and then they had some files on them. So we started there. And then how am I going to be able to get these shows? So I had a program called Audio Hijack or Audio Hijack Pro, either one. So I would pull up the stream from 1650 The Fan and record the audio from my internet connection. So I had to make sure I was at my computer. Then it was at 4 o'clock. Now back here in the central time zone, it's 5 o'clock. I had to make sure, like I was rearranging my dinner plans here in Minnesota. Be like, we got to eat. Are we eating after the show? I got to hit record. Okay, and then I got to come back an hour later. I got to make sure that the recording didn't stop. And it's like 5:02. I'm not hearing anything. I'm sending Kyle a text. Or 15 minutes in, I'm calling the studio. Hey Scott, we got. It was one of those things that to get it going. And now the production is just seamless. So Scott and his crew there definitely have picked up the game. So that, folks, is how you used to get the show delivered. Kyle would send me CDs, and I would sit there and manually record it. So,
oh my! And then the other thing too is if the show started late on that live stream, there would be times where the first couple minutes would be cut off because the live stream didn't start. So
yeah, that was. I even set it up to like, okay, it'll auto record. I just had to make sure that the player was open. I tried to. Automate it. That's the word I'm looking for. I tried to automate it as much as I could, but wasn't always there. Someone always had to be at the controls. But as we move forward, one thing that's unique, and we've brought this up on other shows about the Gable Museum, is there is a professional wrestling wing, and I'm finding that a lot more people are starting to come around to the pro wrestling world and the amateur and collegiate wrestling worlds kind of coexisting, because there was a time that the mention of professional wrestling in a college wrestling arena was like blasphemy.
Yeah, I tell you, Jason, I don't understand it, and I never have, why there's resentment about professional wrestling. It is entertainment. It is scripted. Why get so hung up on that element of it, and people call it fake? It's not fake. It's what it is. It's a form of people to watch these wonderful athletes entertain us in an athletic forum through a scripted format. And it's just like, nobody resents Billy Baldwin for being an actor. Why would you resent Kurt Angle for being an actor too in WWE? Now, did he have a couple terrible movies, Kurt Angle? Yes, he did. But
they were bad.
I mean, but he's awesome. He might be the best professional wrestler technically ever. And I tell you what, he is a tribute to the profession, I think. He had a drug addiction and has gone through that, had some difficulties, but Kurt Angle is outstanding for the profession. And so now you get guys like Chaz Betts, a.k.a. Chad Gable, Jason Jordan. The list goes on and on. A lot of these guys have wrestling backgrounds, and a big part of that is because of Gerald Briscoe having the amateur wrestling background and knowing where to look. And they will tell you, this is a tribute to the sport of wrestling, Jason, is that these people will tell you that they don't have to worry about the amateur wrestlers because they work the hardest. It's the other sports they worry about because they're prima donnas. The wrestlers, they can get in there, they can grit it out. And so we should really take that as an appreciation. But as far as the professional wrestling part, it's part of the history of the sport. This is where we evolved from. And early day professional wrestling had a catch format where it was submission style wrestling, similar to mixed martial arts today without the strikes. And so why wouldn't we embrace that history and let people know that college wrestling matches were in rings for a while before it got too expensive, and just educate people on the history of the sport. So they went in two different directions. College wrestling went pure. Professional wrestling is all entertainment. Hey, professional wrestling has way more people than we do. They get their lowest number for Raw. I looked this up. Monday Night Raw, their worst number on Monday night is better than the best NCAA championship on ESPN. And so that's the gap we need to close. We need to embrace some of their ability to entertain and ability to get to the public, and we can learn from them.
Yeah, and I'm going on a little bit of a pro wrestling angle here because I actually have plans to do a professional wrestling arc on the Short Time Wrestling podcast, which is the flagship show of the Matt Talk Podcast Network. But it goes back to talking to Jerry Briscoe and listening to interviews. You've had Dave Meltzer from the Wrestling Observer newsletter on before, and his stuff has been read pretty much for decades by a lot of people. But I think the fact that professional wrestling now is when Vince McMahon came out and said, yeah, it is entertainment, it kind of pulled the curtain back, and now we're going in, we want to suspend belief, it's entertainment, but at the same point, that kind of lessened the whole, I guess, stigma about it, because people are like, it used to be like, oh my gosh, Hacksaw Jim Duggan and the Iron Sheik are at a bar next to each other having beers. They were just beating the heck out of each other with a 2x4 and an Iranian flag, 2 hours earlier on television. So I think the fact that it shows, they're real people, they have real lives, they're interacting with fans on Twitter, and there's actual the journalism behind the public display of entertainment that we see is, I think, kind of lessen the fact. And then we have Jim Ross and Jerry Briscoe and guys like that always touting the amateur wrestling or college wrestling accolades. You can't mention Dolph Ziggler without mentioning his athletic career at Kent State, or Jack Swagger, and talk about, of course, Jim Ross likes to mention that he's a Sooner and those type of things. But all those things, I think, have lessened the blow between current college wrestling fans and professional wrestling fans.
Yeah, I think it has, and I think the resentment comes from one word. It's that it's called World Wrestling Entertainment, and they use the word wrestling. And so I think when you get the media, the mainstream media, who has no idea about either, and so they think they're funny, and they'll say, hey, not Hulk Hogan, folks, this is real wrestling. And so you just get some resentment. And I don't like it when they do that either. I just think it's a slap in the face to our sport. I wish there would be a little bit more education about it, but it's what we face. And I'll tell you, guys like Chad Gable, Kurt Angle, all of the guys you just mentioned that are in WWE right now, they are embracing their wrestling roots, and it can only do great things to elevate the sport. And does it translate into people turning out to their local high school wrestling meet? Probably not, but it puts us in a different stratosphere, and I think it really does help us for awareness that this is how they got to the level that they are, is through the sport of amateur wrestling.
I know you like to use the term segue and transition when it comes to your guests, and I'm going to segue into this history from professional wrestling and bring it back to the more traditional styles of our college and Olympic and amateur wrestling styles, even though I think people don't even like the term amateur wrestling when we get at the senior levels, because they are professional athletes. But when we look at the Gable Museum, there's one name outside of Gable that always jumps out at me when I go down there, and that is the name of Frank Gotch. And it seems like the Gable Museum is like the one place in wrestling that I've seen, and I guess Mike Chapman could also be attributed to this quite a bit, is it's the place that is keeping Gotch's name alive outside of the state of Iowa as well.
Yeah, and I think it's important to showcase that Frank Gotch really is the driving force behind Iowa's wrestling history, and that people know Iowa for wrestling. And I think it's because of Frank Gotch. Dan Gable took it even higher when he got on the scene, and being in Waterloo, went to Iowa State, and then University of Iowa. He took it to a different dimension. But Frank Gotch really laid the groundwork during an era where Iowa needed a sports hero. And one of our interns is actually doing a paper about that, why Iowa has such a great wrestling tradition, and we don't have pro sports teams here. And so we need something to latch onto. And wrestling is our bread and butter. And it's not bigger than football or baseball or basketball in this state. Make no mistake about it. But even people who are on the fringe, they know about wrestling, and they know that we have a great wrestling history here. And I think that's important, and it traces back to Frank Gotch.
Would it be safe to say that he is the Babe Ruth of wrestling?
I think that would be safe. I think that's a good way to put it, because I think he made a big jump for the sport and took us to a different level, similar to what Babe Ruth did. And I know with Babe Ruth, the numbers were just astronomical given what was going on at that time. I think he doubled the home run count when he started out. And so for him to be at 60, it was just Herculean what he did. So I think it's fair to say that, but unfortunately he hasn't, Frank Gotch being, he hasn't retained his legacy like Babe Ruth did for whatever reason. And I think that's partly because professional wrestling had different heroes and it took a different route, whereas Hulk Hogan, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, those are the guys that took it through the roof. Frank Gotch is now someone that is somewhat of an also-ran.
And it's sad to say that. One thing that has always remained a constant trivia answer is that the only wrestler outside of Hulk Hogan to appear, actually, I take that back, there is another wrestler, but let me get to the official point. The only wrestler to appear on the cover of Sports Illustrated for his wrestling background was Dan Hodge. And I've got the SI behind me. I think it was 56, if I'm not mistaken. And what do you think it's going to take for another wrestler to grace the cover of Sports Illustrated? I mean, they're not weekly anymore; they're bi-weekly. They've cut down their print circulation. But what do you think's going to? When do you think that's going to happen?
I don't think it's going to happen. I think that it's past that time. Two things with that. When Pat Smith won his fourth, I thought there's no way they're going to deny Pat Smith, and I just was waiting to get to Sports Illustrated. Then they just had a short little story inside. I was in 94, and I was pretty naive about the world, and still am to a certain degree, but that was really at a time where I thought, man, he's going to be on the cover. And then Cael Sanderson. I think there was a legitimate case that Cael Sanderson could have and would have been on the cover of Sports Illustrated in 2002 when he concluded his career 159-0 with 4 NCAA championships. But there was a death at a hockey game, and that took over that Sports Illustrated cover. I don't know if you remember, Jason, a few weeks later, there was such outcry from the wrestling community that they actually did a mock-up cover, what it would have looked like if they would have chosen Cael Sanderson. So I think Cael was our closest that we were going to come to getting on the cover. Kyle Dake could have been, but they didn't do that. If people aren't even taking notice of the World Championships and Kyle Snyder and Jordan Burroughs, and I think at one point Mike Golick didn't even know who Jordan Burroughs was. Larry Owings didn't know who Jordan Burroughs was when he stopped by here. We have a long way to go, so I don't really ever see that happening in my lifetime.
Yeah, I think with the Snyder thing, ESPN did go live to him on SportsCenter, which is something that Cael's finals wasn't even on live television, so that's one thing to consider.
They broke into ESPN News to put him live though in 2002. They actually broke into ESPN News and showed that match, so that was pretty special. But I think, didn't they do that with Dake too? I think they broke into.
Well, Dake, they set it up right, and they let off SportsCenter with it. To my, I mean, we were all there in the arena, so we really weren't sure. I just remember sitting at one of the sports bars right around the corner from that would have been the year it was in Des Moines, from the Wells Fargo Center. I'm sitting with Brian Hazard and Shane Sparks, and there's the replay of SportsCenter. They're playing it over and over in this giant bar, of course, because the basketball tournament's going on, and Hazard is in the background calling the broadcast. He was calling the broadcast with Track Wrestling and the NCAA.com, and then there's Dake in the foreground being interviewed. Hazard is in the background being animated. And there's a ton of Cornell people in this bar, and Hazard just stands up and yells, "I'm on SportsCenter!" And of course, they're interviewing Kyle Dake. So, interesting story about ESPN and Kyle Dake, and of course, Brian Hazard stories will go miles. Circling back to what you were talking about not knowing who these people are, does this mean that is this your way of essentially having job security, because it is your goal and your mission with the Gable Museum and the National Wrestling Hall of Fame proper to continue to educate people about the sport of wrestling and know who these heroes are and who they should be?
I think so. I think that we all have a purpose for each of us that's unique, and I think you're uniquely skilled in what you do, and you've created this empire of podcasts and wrestling and announcing. I just think that's what you were meant to do in this world. I feel like for me, I've been given an opportunity, and I love showcasing people and remembering what other people did. And I feel like this is what I was meant to do. And it happens to be that wrestling is my outlet. So that's my goal. And I think that the way you get to that goal is through repetition. It's not just talking about Lee Kemp one time. I think it's talking about him 1,000 times and making sure that there's just this repetition and this understanding of who these people are. And I think that's why what you're doing here with the Mad Talk Online podcast system is great, because you get these people that maybe people don't know about. A couple people that I thought would know about Mike Houck didn't know who Mike Houck was. And so there's just a great opportunity to have that education. And so the more people that know about it, the more people that just talk about it constantly, I think the better it is for our sport. And to understand that just because someone didn't go to Oklahoma State or Iowa or Penn State and they were an NCAA champion, it's a big deal. And I think that a one-timer at Iowa is probably a bigger deal than a three-timer at somewhere else. And I think that we need to do a better job of showcasing who those people are. So I feel like that's what I was meant to do. And I'm just honored to be at this Gable Museum to be able to have that outlet to do it.
Now, when I want to go back to the cover Sports Illustrated thing. By the way, the other wrestler was Roger Huerta, who wrestled at Augsburg, but was on the cover, and I want to say 2007 for a feature they did on mixed martial arts for Ultimate Fighting, and he was a college wrestler, but he was in there in a cage, not in his wrestling singlet. So that was a wrestler.
Hey, but Jason, I think that counts.
I'd say it does.
Why wouldn't that count? Absolutely. So there has been two, and I know the cover you're talking about. That absolutely counts. So there has been two wrestlers. So I mean, just because he's
I'm saying for wrestling, and that's how I set the Dan Hodge question up. But what was cool is I actually have a picture of Dan Hodge signing the Sports Illustrated that he is on from the Hall of Fame 2 years ago. I was like, okay, I got a picture with Dan Hodge signing the SI of Dan Hodge. So that's a cool thing. Now circling back to the relationship, for those who don't know, the Gable Museum and the National Wrestling Hall of Fame were not always one entity. They were not always together. Talk about how the merger came to pass and what it's meant for not just the Gable Museum, but what it's meant for Leroy Smith and the crew down in Stillwater as well.
Well, I think it was at the time that we came to a conclusion that, hey, why should we have two museums working against each other? Not really working against each other, but you're going after the same people and the same funders to try to stay relevant. And so we merged in 2010. It took a while to make that happen, but I think it's been great for us. I hope Stillwater feels like it's benefited them too, that we get to have a dual power throughout the country. And it's Gable and the Smiths working together, and I think that's special. And for anyone who doesn't know the history about that, again, I think it's a good education lesson here that they haven't always been on friendly terms through the course of history. And you go back to the 1984 Olympic trials and what happened there with Leroy Smith and Randy Lewis and the whole history there. It's great that we have an opportunity that an Iowa organization and an organization in Oklahoma are working together to build the sport for the right reasons. And that's really fun. And I'm just glad that we have that National Wrestling Hall of Fame tag on our name.
And you mentioned the Iowa-Oklahoma thing. It takes me back to this past year's Honors Weekend where when Andre Metzger was being inducted and people talking about Andre Metzger beforehand was like, that's Dan. Oh, no, it was Chuck Yeagle was talking about it. And he goes, and he's looking right at Stan Abel. And he goes, that's right, coached by Dan Gable, not Stan Abel. And I mean, it's going back, we're going back 40 years that they've been chipping in. I mean, the Gable-Abel battle still exists to this day.
Yeah, it's I know. But again, there's a history, Jason. There's just a great history that I think once you get into it, you can appreciate, because it is such a personal sport. And you get these stories about Tommy Chesborough puking before the Bedlam duel because he was so nervous that they had to win that. And it was how he sustained his job. And it was such a big deal. And so I want people to go back and learn about why Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, why they drove the sport and how we got to this point. There's just a great history here. And as you mentioned, with those archives that we get to go through, hey, when we go down that basement, Jason, we're like a kid in a candy store. I mean, we just love it. We're uncovering this treasure trove of information, and I just can't get enough, and I know you can't either.
Yeah, and I want to give you from a personal perspective. See, I haven't been around wrestling as long as you have. I mean, you were going to national championships, the year I discovered the sport, and I've been around it since 1995, and that may not seem like a very long time for in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, it's 20 plus years, but it's like I'm still learning about events that happened during my lifetime that I was not aware of. So I'm going back and say, oh wow, this is the 92, a program from the NCAA 92 championships, or like an NCAA wrestling guide that they used to produce through the mid 80s, or finding an actual the actual guide of the paper with Gray Simons on the cover. And I did not wrestle in college, but I call Gray Simons my college coach because I spent a lot of time in the Old Dominion wrestling room. And, here's Gray Simons on the cover of the NCAA wrestling guide. I say, hey, that was my coach. Cause it's like one of those things that just like it puts a reality to the lore that you hear about. People talk about, the pins and the records that Wade Chalice did. And, I'm sure, that's what people became fans of, is they seeing somebody electric to do that, and that gives them such a fond affinity for the sport of wrestling. Gray Simons has that same type of following. Those particular people are getting older, but now we've got this with Jordan Burroughs, Kyle Snyder. And for the women, we've got Helen Maroulis, Adeline Gray. We've got women that can really engage the sport. You've got the women's club also working out there at the Gable Museum. So as we're looking, we've got a gotch for the men. Who would be that iconic figure that maybe our kids are going to be talking to each other about 50 years from now about who set the bar for women's wrestling?
I think for me it's Tricia Saunders, but I don't know for current day, since that was a few years ago. I think it's Helen Maroulis. I think she's just taken us to another level. At one point, Adeline Gray, and I still think she's in that conversation. But those two, I just think that even I would mark out seeing Adeline Gray and Helen Maroulis. You just see them like, oh my gosh, they're here. And I get that same way with a Kyle Snyder, Jordan Burroughs. It's like they're actually here. And all those people, where if they come in the museum, if Tom Brands or Terry Brands or John Smith or Kale, when they're around and their credentials, there's just an awe and aura about them that, hey, they got it done and they did something so spectacular that you have to respect that. And it's a lot of fun to be around.
Using the pro wrestling term there, marked out, I like it. Now, my question is I guess I'm in the same boat as this. If you're around, there's that aura and that awe. I think I experience that more with those who are in the generation or two before me. Like, if I'm around Kale, it's not like, oh my gosh, it's Kale Sanderson, because Kale is my age. I mean, we're 2 months apart in age. We graduated high school the same year, so there's not that like aura factor. I mean, yeah, it's awesome. That's Kale. He did awesome things. But do you think it has to do with like when I look over at my wall right now? I've got Brad Veering's Greco-Roman World Championship on the wall. I've got John Smith, Sergey Beloglazov, Bruce Baumgartner. I got a bobblehead of Gable and Baumgartner. These are the people that when I first met Bruce Baumgartner, I was like shaking because he was like, this is an active big man that is, as you're an upperweight guy, this is a guy you want to be like wrestle like. Him and Kerry McCoy were two favorite wrestlers of all time. So when you meet Bruce or you meet Gable the first time, I can understand that. But do you think being around these people so much has kind of maybe desensitized you to the awesomeness of it, or do you just like still like fanboy all the time when you get to talk to wrestling with these people?
It's a mix, and I think you put it in its proper place. And so, for an example, when a couple years ago, we had the Last Chance qualifier was across the street, and we hosted the weigh-ins. I was marking out. It was like I was back to being that kid that was into wrestling. And so you had all these NCAA champions, and you mentioned a story about just people coming through and you don't recognize them. We have this NCAA champions mat that all the Division I NCAA champions get to sign in the Gable Teaching Center. And so I'd seen someone that was a D1 champion. I say, hey, will you sign this? And then I hear this voice behind me. And he said, hey, do I get to sign that too? And I said, are you a D1 champ? And he said, yeah. I said, well, what's your name? And he says, Brian Dolph, and he had won it in 1990. And so it's kind of like, wow, that's so cool that you have those opportunities. So I think when you just are a fan and you're not in your work environment, that's when you get to have fun and just get excited about who these people are. But when you're in the professional realm of it, it gets a little bit different. But every time I see John Smith, I mark out for him. So I'll admit it.
Now, you also have a unique relationship with Dan Gable in terms of the museum bears his name, and you've spent a lot of time with Gable over the years, and you've written a book called, Wrestling Life 2 with Coach Gable, a sequel to Scott Schulte's book. And we haven't talked about that much. We're going to actually save that for short time eventually. But when we talk about your relationship with Gable, how did you, when you first met him, did you ever think, years forward that you'd be, really not just on a first name basis with this guy, but hanging out in the sauna, writing a book with him? I mean, that's got to be, it's rare air for somebody that grew up in the state of Iowa as a wrestling fan.
Yeah, no question about it. It's really out of the realm of anything that I thought possible when you think about it. And when you look back and you just look at the things you did to get to this point, it seems like it was a natural progression. But when you make that stark contrast and you say, hey, the first time you met Gable till now, no way could I have ever thought that. My dad brings it up too. I was at a junior high swim meet watching someone here in Cedar Falls, and his daughter was competing, and I looked up and there was Gable sitting by himself, and I went up and talked to him. And I was a huge Oklahoma State fan at the time, and I still like Oklahoma State, but I would just wear it on my sleeve. And he's like, yeah, you're the Oklahoma State guy. And so he just, yeah, so he knew that, and because my mom went to Oklahoma State, and so he just knew me as that. But yeah, there's no way you could ever dream of that happening. So what a great opportunity. Just like you. I mean, could you ever dream that you would have been announcing at the Olympic Games?
No.
I mean, is that in the realm of your possibility?
No, it really wasn't. So. It really wasn't. I mean, it's amazing.
How would that happen? I mean, I couldn't even thought it for you in 2009 when we were doing the show together, let alone here we are, 2016, 7 years later to be at the NCAA championships. I never saw that happening for you, but you did the right things and you got to that point. So I just think, again, it's repetition. It's doing things consistently over and over, and there's no such thing as a magic wand. And you just you happen to be in the right place at the right time, and you've done things the right way over the course of time, and you get great opportunities like this. So super honored to be able to work on that book with Dan. It was the thrill of a lifetime.
What was your favorite story out of that? If there's one Gable story, I've only got one funny story about Gable at the moment. Actually, we have one from Wrestling 411, probably not one we can share, but but
I know which one too.
Yep. He's a big baseball fan, so when there's a story, if there's one that Coach is telling you, and you just start cackling up that you cannot believe that this actually happened, and it has to be true.
Well, the one that when you say that, you always have to go with the first one that pops in your mind, and I fought hard to get this story in, because he didn't want to do it. And it's probably the shortest story in the book. It's the time he pooped his pants at the Midlands, and he was in the opening round, and he was using too much gas. And so he's like, I don't want that in there. And I said, Dan, you publicly went out there. You talked about it publicly. So it's not like it's unknown. You brought it up. He's like, okay. So I got it in there. And every time I go and read that, it just absolutely cracks me up, because it really humanizes Dan, and it just shows how quirky and funny he is, because the way he tells it, it's just pretty funny. So the shortest story in the book is the funniest and the most memorable one for me.
Yeah, well, I think one of my favorite Gable story, again, this one thing about these coaches, because John Smith and Dan Gable, they have an everyman quality about them, because they will, if you of course, I'm sure they don't mind being kind of, not for lack of a better term, worshipped by people, but you talk to them normal, they're normal guys too. And I think the one thing that really kind of put Gable on like the human level was we were in Madison for the World Team Trials. I'm not sure what year it was, and we went over to I think it was Mark Hall's house for a barbecue for the USA Wrestling Awards, and I'm standing there in line next to Gable, and he and I look, he's got a Mountain Dew in one hand, and he finishes that. And then he reaches in his back pocket. He's got a can of Hamm's beer. And those of you out in the Midwest that know Hamm's beer, man, this is not good stuff. Okay, this is like, it's basically out east. It's your Natty Light or your Busch Light. No offense, I know some people in Iowa just love their Busch Light, but it's like Hamm's is kind of like a running joke a lot of places. It's like, you got Hamm's. There he is, pulls out the Hamm's, cracks open a beer, and just starts. It's like, that is a normal guy with very awesomely abnormal traits, like, dedication. It's like, I'm sitting there, I was like, okay, I'm having a beer with Dan Gable. That's a cool story to tell.
Yeah, this is a cool story, and it's cool that you get that opportunity to do that with the icon in our sport. And there's been some great people that have transcended the sport, and Cale Sanderson, Jordan Burroughs, on and on and on. But to have Gable in the mix, that's a fun opportunity.
Yeah, you're not going to get a beer with Cale. He doesn't drink. So that being said,
well, there you go.
The merchandise sale, the artifact sale coming to the Dan Gable Museum, 303 Jefferson Street, Waterloo, Iowa, right down there next to the, what is it called? The Crossplex? Is that the name of the building?
Sportsplex. Cedar Valley Sportsplex.
Cedar Valley Sportsplex, yep. Right off of 280, Highway 280, where I totaled my car at the 2009 National Duels. One exit past that. Kyle and crew will be there all weekend as part of the preseason Nationals. If you are listening to this after October 26, 27, 28, 29, still stop on by the Gable Museum anytime you're in Waterloo. Like I said, if you're driving through Waterloo Cedar Falls on 280, you know where to stop. 303 Jefferson. Kyle, always a pleasure. Now, this time I can actually put you on the spot versus vice versa, which is normally the case.
Well, hey, I appreciate this. This was a lot of fun, just talking about the history and forcing me to think about some things that I don't think about daily. So I like that in an interview. So I appreciate the time and having me on.
You've been listening to the World Wrestling Resource Podcast, proudly presented by Defense Soap. Again, every product is backed by our unconditional 100% money-back guarantee. Find out more from Guy and the Gang at defensesoap.com.
Show is part of the Matt Talk Podcast Network. For more wrestling podcasts, head over to MattTalkOnline.com.